All right, we're back, folks. Thanks for tapping in to this episode of Do Your Homework. I know it's been a while. Sorry for those of you who have waited. It's been a hell of a year for me. We can get into that later, but I'm excited to begin making this content again for you guys. To start, I believe there are two very pressing issues. Um, I'm going to do my best to be brief today, but I want to start first with the threat of nuclear war, which will be a good segue into my next episode on current events, which will cover the obvious demolition job the Biden administration is undertaking during this transition and what I believe will be a vain attempt to hinder Trump from asserting his agenda. We will touch on it briefly here as it relates to relations with Russia, but without further ado, let's get started. When I last came to you guys, it was shortly before the Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin. I really wanted to do an episode on that and just never got around to it. Kept my notes. I actually watched it 2 or 3 times. I really enjoyed the interview. But I'm going to revisit it here now to discuss some of the high notes of the interview and the status of the war in Ukraine, and then cover Tucker's latest interview with the Russian foreign minister as a means to discuss, changes on the ground, escalation, and, sort of how we need to be shaping our perception on this. So, first, let's just get into the Putin interview. I thought to start his astute knowledge of the history of the Rus was insightful for those who don't understand the context of what's going on over there. We'll get into some more recent events when we get into the Lavrov interview, but he went all the way back to the beginning of the Rus people and was like, we are all one in some way or another. The only thing that separates Kiev from Moscow is, frankly, Polish domination, which occurred during the 14th and 15th centuries. It started with Lithuania. Actually, it was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and then it turned into the Grand Duchy of Poland-Lithuania. So Poland and Lithuanian dominance over Kiev from about 1400 to 1659-ish is what separates the Muscovites from the Rus. That's it. The Muscovites from the Kievan Rus. That's it. And so he generally believes in them as brothers and sisters and cousins, and like we are all part of the same people instead of viewing them separately. And if you're not really willing to understand the context of this situation, I don't think it's appropriate for you to sit here and say that you have a valid opinion on it. So if you haven't watched it or you fast forwarded that part, I would highly suggest watching it. Literally nothing he said in there has been debunked at all by anybody with any sort of credibility because it's objectively true. Soon after that history lesson, Tucker Carlson asked him a question along the lines of, are you afraid about how reliant your economy is on China, or how dependent your country is on China? And Putin kind of laughs and then passes the buck off to the Europeans and says the Europeans have more reliance. Their economy has more reliance on China than we do. Their cooperation with China is increasing even more than ours. Are they afraid? I don't know. Ask them. Let's not reason, this is what he said. No, let's not reason on those terms. Okay, we're not bride and groom, bitterness and resentment. It's not about those things. Let's find common ground. And that has really been a staple of Russia's entire foreign relations with the West since the fall of the USSR. We're a market economy now. Let's find common ground in that and a peaceful resolution so that we can work our way back into the good graces of the collective West. Something that took years to build up, by the way, and started in 1700 with Peter the Great. Peter the Great, at one point, charged his nobility, I believe they're called boyars, charged them a beard tax to keep their beards, which was a cultural custom at that time because he wanted them to appear more European and shave their faces. So if you wanted to keep your beard, you had to have a tax. That's how committed the Russians have been to assimilating and being a part of the fabric of Western European culture. They view themselves as European. They do not view themselves as Asian or Eurasian. But Europe continually rejects them. And with the help of U.S. through NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Putin described an erroneous, crude, completely unjustified policy of pressure that was pursued against Russia. And he was right. What is he talking about for those of you who don't know? The expansion of NATO to the Russian border, pressure. Backing separatist groups in the Russian periphery, Georgia, Chechnya, pressure. Never-ending economic sanctions, pressure. Backing the Ukrainian coup and the subsequent war effort. It's all pressure, pressure, pressure. He said that word at least a dozen times, and he's exactly right. Exactly right. These are all elements of pressure. Some may disagree on the answer, but all of us should be asking ourselves the same question. Why have the relations between the U.S. and Russia gotten worse since the end of the Cold War and not better? Who benefits from this policy of pressure that we've been exerting after the fall of the after we accomplished our goal, which is getting rid of the Soviet Union? Why have things not changed? And just as important, who benefits from that? Now, that last question we can ask for just about anything in economics, politics, or war. For example, going back to the Putin interview again, Tucker asked him point blank who blew up Nord Stream. And Putin answers plainly, basically the CIA. He says you, and they kind of have that banter back and forth. And then he's like, the CIA has no such alibi. I love the explanation he gives after this, because Tucker sort of presses him like, if you have sources and you can prove this, why haven't you put them out? And he basically says the Western media machine is big. All I can do is shine a light on my sources and hope people pay attention to it, but they're just going to demean me as a liar anyway. It's a machine that I can't really go up against. And he says explicitly, American financiers, they're not really American financiers, but the people who run the financial institutions in our country benefit the most from our media. Shocker there. And that it's difficult for him to do something like that. But if you want to try to figure it out yourself, ask yourself who is interested. I think a better word is who is incentivized. Who is incentivized to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline? And then for many instances, I think for all instances, but he said especially the big ones, you have to ask yourself who is capable. Because you may be incentivized to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline, but you're not capable of going tens of thousands of feet underwater, planting a bomb, blowing it up with little to no evidence left behind without a trace. Who can do that? Who's capable of that? Well, you're left with CIA and Mossad. That's it. Who else could have done it? When you ask those questions, it narrows down your list of possible perpetrators tremendously. I want us to take a brief moment right now to look inward at ourselves and ask, who is incentivized to open our borders? Who would be interested in sending our weapons of war and self-defense halfway around the world while simultaneously neglecting the security issues that come with refusing to enforce federal immigration law and vetting standards? Who is incentivized to push barely tested vaccines onto children and young people? Who is capable of shutting down every business in America? Why would they do that? What is their end game? Who has the incentive to subsidize proxy hybrid wars across the globe while at the same time leaving America vulnerable to incursion at home? Who is incentivized and capable of subverting an entire culture? Sounds like someone who despises American people and America, our way of life, our sovereignty and neutrality. Sounds to me like somebody who wishes to undercut our values, to subvert our culture and history, and leverage our resources for their own pleasure. Now, let's apply the test to specific adversaries. Are Russia and China interested and capable of crippling America? Interested in a military extent, sure. Possibly they both recognize that, of course they recognize that the United States military machine is a machine, and it is, to an extent, hard to deal with. And so, sure, would they be interested in crippling that? Yeah. Only insofar as it affects them, though. If that machine's pointed elsewhere, they don't care. They also both recognize what America brings to the global marketplace, and they need access to our markets and capital to optimize their own economic output. It's necessary. They need our capital markets. They need to be able to buy and sell goods here and do it on equal footing elsewhere, right? Plus, why would they want us to have weapons, men, and equipment in Europe and Asia right on their doorstep? Is it not safer for them to have men and equipment thousands of miles away where they could do no harm? And how could they possibly even be capable of subverting our entire military industrial complex to tell us where to put our troops or influence that in any way? Who benefits the most from moving American weapons of defense, scattering our fighting men and equipment across the globe, while allowing unvetted access to America for criminals and terrorists, and is capable of doing all of that, versus who's actually doing it? Right? Who's incentivized? Who is capable? And then lastly, this is something that I know is real because it wasn't talked about. Putin mentioned twice the golden billion. Who is the golden billion that he alluded to? And why is there a push among many of the elites, the WEF, people in the UN, Agenda 2030, all that other stuff, to limit the human population to about this figure under the guise of saving the planet from climate change? Who stands to gain the most from World War III, which would help them get to limiting the human population to that number? When you get to the intersection of incentive, interest, and capability, you will quickly and clearly realize where the true danger is. Okay? I'll leave that there for now and let you all discern the rest on your own. This is why it's called Do Your Homework. We're going to move on to more recent events and discuss the interview with Lavrov. Before I get into the interview with Lavrov, let's break down the Ukrainian war a little bit as it stands today. Ukraine is on its last leg. I do not see them holding out very much longer, regardless of what weapons they have, if they do not get an influx of 500,000 men sometime within the next 4 months. Where are those men going to come from? I don't know. I'm not going to be one of them. I can surely tell you that. But Russia will accomplish all of its strategic objectives. I don't think one of them is to take over the entire country. But once Toretsk and Pokrovsk are taken, Pokrovsk is right now currently being outflanked from the west. Once those rail lines are cut and the city is cut off and they are forced to retreat, there are no secondary defenses for them to fall back on. They're at the last line of defense right now. And once Russia makes that breakthrough, they'll have the ability to go either north or south to outflank the forces there, and the whole line will be forced to move back to an undetermined location because there's no defensive position to fall back to. So at that point, it'll turn into a bit of a rout. And then once they've occupied all the regions in Ukraine that we're getting ready to discuss right now, it's going to be purely a defensive war where they're going to dig in and keep the grip on what they have. They're not going to waste men foolhardily trying to take over the entirety of Ukraine. I don't think they have the stomach for that. I don't think they view it as necessary. And I think they will, once they've accomplished what they came to do, they will hold tight and wait for the peace agreements to be signed. The Russian foreign minister, as far as the what that peace would look like, reiterated a lot of the same things that Putin alluded to, as far as getting them out of the regions in the Donbass that had referendums in 2022. The conclusion of those referendums were that they changed their constitution to join the Russian Federation. So as they see it, that is legally Russian land, and Ukraine has to leave. Ukraine legally sees it as their land. They don't recognize the referendums because that's what we do in the West. If we have a vote that we don't like the outcome of, an election that we don't like the outcome of, we will just ignore it and say it's not real. And that's exactly, or that they cheated. But I think that those people have not wanted to be a part of Ukraine for a long time. The Minsk agreements get into it about how they are a semi-autonomous states that are allowed to, have their own police force, allowed to be consulted when appointments are made by the central government. They're allowed to vote on their own stuff. I mean, they have their own constitutions, which have now been amended so that they could join Russia, so that they could have the backing of the Russian government, military protection, so to speak. One of the things that he reiterated was the West's desire for a strategic defeat of Russia, Lavrov did and Putin did. It's been mentioned several times. I wish Tucker would have peeled back that onion a bit and asked him to elaborate on what that means from the Russian perspective. We can make an educated guess based on rhetoric that we've heard from both sides, but it would have been nice to approach the topic head on to understand from their view what strategic defeat looks like to the West. To what end? What does a post-Russia world look like or do for the winners? Do you share Putin's belief that the goal is for the West to break down the Rus into tribes and use their combined potential, these are Putin's words, using combined potential in final confrontation with China? And again, back to what we discussed a second ago, who is incentivized and capable of doing that, of taking on that undertaking? That would have been great to hear, and why they think that's happening. I'd like to understand why they think this is happening to them. Because I think it's important. I think it's important to understand all sides of the art. Because I certainly don't understand why we're doing it. I have no clue why United States politicians have gone this route. I have an idea, but I think we've been infiltrated to meet somebody's own ends. This discussion with Tucker Carlson wasn't as entertaining or intense as the Putin interview, but it was very informative and necessary in its own right. As we talked about earlier, the U.S. has clearly upped the stakes in escalating this conflict, now using American military personnel to operate long-range missile systems to kill Russians deep within Russia, which, not coincidentally, has happened in the days and weeks since Trump won the election after campaigning to end this conflict. They're trying to escalate it. It's clear they're trying to tie his hands to undermine his second term. Even Lavrov mentions this later on when alluding to what Obama did during his transition, which we'll get into. I was very impressed with Lavrov. He does not speculate at all. He sticks only to the relevant facts and laws around the topic at hand. When asked who he thought was making U.S. foreign policy, he said he would not guess who is in charge of American foreign policy. I have a guess, Lavrov. I think you do too. I just don't think you want to say it out loud. He provided a lot of insight to me that I didn't already know to really help me understand more contextually in recent years how this war came to be. The coup in 2014 isn't news. We won't get into that. But what I didn't know is that beginning in 2017, the Ukrainian government has been actively passing laws that disallow the use of Russian language, the ability to teach in Russian, read books in Russian, read books from Russian authors, do plays or movies in Russian, Russian media companies from operating in Ukraine, Ukrainian media companies from operating in Russia. The list goes on. It's absolutely ridiculous. He goes on to bring up that this violates the UN Charter, which grants people safety from discrimination on the basis of language, along with gender, sexual orientation, race, and I think there's one more. And I think language might be the last one, or there might be another one. I don't remember offhand. But why does the U.S. media never bring this up? Why would they not bring up the fact that our ally is currently in violation of numerous international laws, including people's freedom to speak at all, let alone freedom of speech? You know, they try to tout Ukraine as this pillar of democratic freedom, yet all the while they're clearly and obviously violating human rights on the basis of words, of what words they use. And as a country founded on freedom of speech and self-governance, it seems impossible to me that our values could align with a country that is actively taking people's right to speak their own language. It's crazy. It's ridiculous. The same people who scream Islamophobia or xenophobia to people here who do not want unvetted immigration are the same people who think it's okay for Ukraine to outlaw an entire language. Make it make sense. Love to rant and rave about human rights abuses when it benefits their agenda, such as what we've seen in the Middle East and with immigration policy over the last 4 years. But this has been going on for 7 years over there in Ukraine, and you nor I have heard a word about it until last week. I'm going to get into a few quotes from Lavrov, and then I'm going to wrap this thing up. Some things that I thought were really cool. Right to self-determination is the legal basis for decolonization. I did not know that, actually. But it made sense when he started explaining that, they use that as the legal basis because the people in the colonies never viewed their colonizers as representing their own interests and rights, and that they wanted that standard applied evenly to all people around the world for the right to self-determination. Well, that includes Russian people in Ukraine. They have a right to speak Russian. You cannot unilaterally strip people of their rights based on language. Can't do that. So if you're going to support the self-determination of people in the Congo to no longer be a part of Belgium, which I support, then I also, on the same token, have to recognize the right of self-determination for Russians living in Ukraine who do not want to be part of Ukraine. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. My second favorite was Lindsey Graham saying the quiet part out loud in front of Zelensky, that Ukraine is sitting on rare earth metals and we cannot leave this to Russia. I thought the Russian foreign minister said, they fight for the exploitation of the labor and resources. We're fighting only on behalf of the freedom of our brothers and sisters, our Russian brothers and sisters who are there. Now, is that a little bit fluffed up? Yeah. No, it's not like I believe every word these guys say. But he's certainly right about why we're over there. Why do you think BlackRock's bought up all that land over there? What do you think their expectation was? One, it was cheap because it's war-torn. So when there's blood in the streets, you buy the land. That's a Rothschild quote, by the way. Talk about interest and capable. And then the war ends. You discover something there. You build back on top of it, and you make a killing. That's the whole reason we're over there. This has nothing to do with people's self-determination. We got to get that out of our head. A lot of these other ones get into why the situation's been so testy. The quote of Zelensky saying that people in Russia, for the sake of their kids and grandkids, need to get out the Russian. What does that mean? What are you going to do if we speak Russian, which is totally legal? What the hell is that? We have Russian American citizens currently in the U.S. Could you imagine any group here speaking of exterminating another the way that Ukrainian military leaders talk about exterminating Russians to give their kids less things to do? Like, this is anti-American. I don't know how you can possibly be on board with supporting this government. Their absolute silence on the massacre in Bucha since it happened has been something I've talked about a little bit off and on in private conversations. If the Russians had really done that, the West would not stop talking about it ever. Instead, they put some dead bodies in the street, put them on camera, and said the Russians killed them. The Russians said, wait, that's horrible, man. Who are those people that you put on camera? Like, can we get the names of these people? Are they Russian citizens? Do we know who they are? Silence, nothing. No, we don't know anything. Okay, sure. The lab results for Alexei Navalny, the same thing. You poisoned him, did we? Show me those lab results. No. Okay. Like what? Imagine you go to court and they say, Christian, you murdered somebody. I say, who? They say, we're not telling you. I say, where's the evidence? They say, we don't have any. We're not giving it to you. And then you go to court and the judge is like, do you have the evidence? Yeah. They just give it to the judge and the judge looks at it and says, you're guilty. You don't even know what it is. Again, guys, this is simply un-American. This is not what we're about here. How can we be on board with this behavior? Like, you got to take a principled stance at some point and say, this ain't right. This just ain't right. I don't care if I don't like them or if I do. I'm indifferent about it. I don't care about these people. I don't know these people. But this, why are we involved? Why are my tax dollars being used for this? It's crazy. Moving on to the referendums in Donbass that I didn't know about that happened in 2022. Again, this stuff just does not get reported in the West. There were 4 regions, okay? One of them was like 93%. Another one was like 92%. Another one 88%, all to change the Constitution to join the Russian Federation, okay? Even if it was rigged. Let's say it's rigged 20%. That goes from 90% of people to 70% of people. That is still a landslide, guys. If it's 30% rigged, it's still a landslide, guys. It's not even close. They don't want to be part of Ukraine. It's okay. Let them not be a part of Ukraine. They're free to make that decision. Let it go. You know, and it's crazy that, one of the reasons that Ukraine only brings up territorial integrity when it comes to getting Russia out. It does not say anything about the right to self-determination, because then they would have to acknowledge that they are being hypocrites about the people in Donbass's right to self-determination. They won't bring it up, and I'll get into that here in a second. He said Russia's learned a lot from the sanctions and the economic ties with China, which are their neighbor. I want to remind people they literally have the longest border on the planet. It's well over 1,000 miles. Those ties are permanent. I don't know if the military ones are. Russia sends weapons to India. I don't know how trusting the Chinese are going to be of the Russians if a conflict ever were to break out, but it is likely smart for them to maintain the facade that they would cooperate if a conflict were to break out, especially a nuclear conflict. He said it became clear soon after the dissolution of the USSR that Russia, quote, would not be seen on equal footing with the West, which I think is true. I honestly believe in rather than a bipolar, a triumvirate of superpowers with the United States, Russia, and China is the best way to balance power in the world right now. Allow Russia to have its sphere of influence. We will still maintain our sphere of influence. China has its own sphere of influence. And I think that will keep from having any. I think the two can always contain the one, right? If there's three, there's balance. If there's two, then you get divided. If you have Russia and China and the U.S. and the collective West, that invites conflict versus a tripolar balance of power on the global stage with smaller junior partners at the regional stage is likely the better course of action. And I think Russia probably believes this as well. It's going to be very difficult for the United States to convince them that we believe it based on the policy of pressure that Putin alluded to and that we talked about earlier. He admitted that the Democrats are actively undermining Trump's transition in the context of relations with Russia. Obviously, you got the escalation of the war right now, but he also told a story I didn't know of Obama getting rid of all the Russian diplomats in this country and seizing their property, which is illegal, in the waning days of December of 2020, which gave the Trump administration a shaky footing to try to rebuild diplomatic communications with Russia. And now, obviously, Biden allowing us to blow things up in Russia, it's ridiculous. Like I said, we'll cover more of that in the next episode of the transition. Lastly, this is my favorite. We talked about this just a second ago. The UN Charter. He says the UN Charter is not a menu. You have to take it in its entirety. Just like I said, Ukraine cannot assert its territorial integrity claims under the Charter while ignoring the right to self-determination of ethnic Russians in Ukraine, which is also covered in the Charter. You have to enforce the Charter in its entirety, meaning that they have to roll back all that legislation. They have to allow these people to vote. They have to allow them to have their own self-determination and self-governance. Or you just say the hell with it and just don't do it, which is, again, also fine. It's also okay for you guys to be at war over this. I'm not mad at you. It's not my war. That's what I hope. That's the conclusion I hope we come to here in a second, is that this is not our war. I personally believe that our government's desire to handpick which rules of the UN to follow, which countries we have do which stuff for us on what basis, it just undermines our ability and our right to remain neutral and sovereign on our own, because we have so many obligations to other people. It undermines our sovereignty, our ability to act in our own self-interest, and to remain neutral. The American people in November spoke. We do not want to be entangled in everyone else's problems. We don't want to fight their battles. Our focus is and should be on enhancing the American society and way of life here at home. And if you want to spread that, well, then spread the Constitution. Make Ukraine adopt the Constitution of the United States of America, and then maybe we can talk about whether they have a right to self-determination or territorial integrity. Until then, it's not my problem. They don't even abide by our values. They can't claim to be of us. Look at how they behave. That's un-American. It's ridiculous. And who could possibly see American self-interest as a detriment? What is their incentive to keep us scattered across the globe, constantly fighting, in debt, on the ropes, kids committing suicide, childless people all over the place, lack of families, a declining population rate? Who's incentivized to have that? What is their end game? These are questions that need to be asked and answered by us younger millennials, and especially you, Gen Z, man. God damn it, Gen Z. Gen Z, we need help, man. I need your help, guys. I need you to see through it. I need you to see through it. I need you to be smart enough to ask the questions in front of the public market and really have open and honest discourse in order for us to have true transparency and freedom and to understand where the source of our problems comes from. That's it for today, guys. I hope you all enjoyed this comeback episode. It was a little bit long. I'm sorry. To give you a taste of what is to come next week, I will be putting out 2 episodes. As I talked about, the first will expand on the Trump transition, how they're looking to preemptively sabotage his agenda. The next one, I will return to Aristotle's politics, discuss self-governance, self-determination a little bit more in depth, how our Constitution embodies that sort of principle, and how we should be managing households to become ungovernable. Thanks for tapping in. I'll see you guys next time.